Late winter on the Colorado Plateau is a season of uneasy transition, a time when the earth can't decide if it's ready for rebirth. Stretches of snow recede from the roots of brittle sagebrush and stunted pines, leaving the land patchworked with frost-bitten grass, dry brown earth, and memories of a harsher cold. In this liminal space stands a small log cabin, its wood darkened by decades of storms, its windows dim against the pale morning sun. Inside, David Cole moves with the careful silence of someone long accustomed to solitude. At 45, his frame is still strong, shoulders square, bearing the kind of muscle and weathered lines that mark a life built on endurance rather than comfort. Once he was a Marine, disciplined, relentless, unflinching. Now he is simply a man alone, carrying old ghosts and a battered thermos of black coffee to his porch each morning, scanning the land as if expecting an enemy to rise from the snow. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a story. On this particular morning, something does rise. A movement that doesn't belong to the wind or the magpies scavenging along the fence line. David sets his mug down, steps to the edge of the porch, and narrows his eyes at the far side of the field, where a streak of red slashes the white snow like a wound that refuses to heal. For a moment, he thinks it's the shadow of a dying day, but then he sees it. A bobcat, its fur matted and one hind leg dragging, making halting progress through the thin snow. He has seen predators before: coyotes, mountain lions, even a rare wolf, all of them wary of human scent. But this animal doesn't flinch. Its yellow eyes are steady, watching him with a kind of fierce intelligence. Blood drips steadily from a fresh gash along its flank, a red signature on the pale crust. The sight tightens something in David's chest, stirring the instincts that training never quite erased. There's a story here, he thinks. Out here, everything leaves a mark. The bobcat pauses, head low, then limps forward again. Not away, but closer to David's cabin. The wind gusts, carrying the animal's scent, wild, coppery, threaded with pain and old cedar. It stops, glances at him, then swings its head toward the far field, as if inviting him to follow. David hesitates. Years of isolation have taught him to let wild things be. But curiosity, sharpened by loneliness and the echo of old commands, pushes him off the porch. He follows at a distance, boots crunching softly over thawing snow and brittle grass. The bobcat moves ahead, slow but deliberate, leaving a trail that weaves between outcrops of dark rock and winter-dried brush. It's not until they reach the far side of the property, at a dip in the land David rarely visits, that he understands the animal's urgency. The ground here is different, disturbed, as if a great weight has shifted beneath. Fresh earth slumps toward the center of the field, where a jagged circle of snow has collapsed into itself, exposing raw soil and tangled roots. The bobcat stops at the edge, hunching low, ears flattened. A faint metallic tang rises from the newly opened wound in the earth. David steps closer, heart hammering, not with fear, but with the old adrenaline rush he hasn't felt in years. He scans the sinkhole's rim, noting the unnatural angles, the twisted debris half buried in mud and ice. Whatever happened here, it wasn't the slow work of time. The bobcat limps a few steps along the edge, glances back, and lets out a guttural growl that echoes down into the pit. David peers into the sinkhole. At first, all he sees is blackness, cold, silent, unknowable. But as his eyes adjust, he makes out the outline of something man-made beneath the churned soil, a rusted metal shape, just visible where the collapse has torn the ground open. Pipes, maybe, or the frame of a forgotten structure. He crouches low, examining the edge, fingers sifting through clumps of earth. He finds a length of cracked plastic, sharp with the smell of old chemicals, and a faded scrap of yellow caution tape nearly swallowed by mud. There's more to this than a simple cave-in. His breath fogs in the cold air, mixing with the bobcat's growls. The animal paces, restless, gaze fixed on the opening, as if it knows secrets buried beneath. David studies it, feeling a kinship. Two wounded things, drawn by the land's pain and the promise of answers. For a moment, man and beast are partners in silence, both unsettled by the scars they share. As the first rays of sun break through the clouds, lighting up the exposed ground, David feels the weight of the moment settle over him. Whatever lies in the darkness below, it has been waiting. Maybe for years, maybe for him. The bobcat flicks its tail, turns to face him, and for an instant, David thinks he sees understanding in those wild eyes. The world holds its breath, suspended between winter and spring, between past and possibility. David stands on the threshold, the promise of revelation pulling him forward, even as the ground beneath his feet whispers of danger yet to come. The sun was still weak in the pale morning sky when David stood at the rim of the sinkhole, his breath curling in cold puffs. The bobcat lingered nearby, tense and watchful, its wild body a silent companion. David's mind raced with possibilities. Was this a collapsed well, an old mining shaft, or something more sinister? The fragments of plastic, the stink of chemicals, and the half-buried yellow tape suggested human hands had disturbed this earth long ago, and not for honest work. Driven by a mixture of duty and dread, David circled the hole, boots leaving careful prints in the damp soil. He scanned the edges for signs of stability, years of military training reminding him that the ground could give way at any moment. Yet curiosity, the relentless urge to understand, tugged him closer. He crouched to get a better look at the metalwork exposed in the shadows, a corroded pipe, twisted by the earth's slow violence, and beneath it, a hint of something hollow and dark. He reached for a nearby branch and probed the rim, testing the resistance. The bobcat crept closer, its body low and wary, as if it too sensed the danger. David felt the soil crumble slightly beneath his feet, but pressed on, inching toward the edge until he could see more of the tangled metal below. The pit seemed to breathe, exhaling a chill that prickled his skin. Suddenly, without warning, the ground betrayed him. It started as a tremor, a subtle shift. Then the earth beneath his boots gave way with a crack like splitting bone. For an instant, David tried to leap back, but the world spun in a blur of snow and sky. The next moment, gravity seized him, and he tumbled downward, swallowed by darkness. He crashed hard, the impact rattling his bones and driving the air from his lungs. Pain flared in his right shoulder and hip, but training kicked in. He forced himself to stay still, to listen for further collapse. Debris tumbled past, clattering against rusted pipes and echoing in the hollow below. For a moment, all was blackness. Then his eyes adjusted, and he realized he had landed in an old man-made tunnel, its walls slick with condensation and streaked with ancient stains. David's heart pounded as he inventoried his body for injuries. His leg throbbed, but nothing seemed broken. He pushed himself up, wincing at the pain, and glanced upward. The shaft he'd fallen through was now a twisted maw of earth, choked with splintered roots and collapsed dirt. There was no climbing out the way he'd come. The path was sealed, the morning sky now a distant memory. He fumbled for his flashlight, hands numb with cold and adrenaline. When the beam flickered on, it revealed a narrow corridor braced with warped timber, stretching in both directions. Cobwebs hung like ghosts, and the air tasted of mold and rust. David pressed one hand to the wall, steadying himself. The tunnel was old, but not ancient. This was no relic of pioneer days. The metal pipes were modern, built for industry, and the faint stink of chemicals was stronger here, more insistent. He called out, first for help, then for the bobcat, absurdly hoping the animal might still be nearby. Silence answered. Above, the wind howled, but down here only his own breath echoed. He swept the flashlight over the ground, searching for clues, for some hint of why this tunnel existed beneath his land. A crumpled oil drum lay half buried in the silt, its label faded but still legible in places. Apex Terra Resources. David's pulse quickened. He knew the name. A faceless corporation rumored to have leased land for drilling across the county, always denying any wrongdoing when locals complained of poisoned water or dead livestock. He kicked the drum, sending up a cloud of dust, and studied the faint boot prints leading deeper into the darkness. Someone had been here recently. His mind sharpened, senses alert. He scanned the tunnel, listening for the telltale drip of water, the scuttle of rodents, anything that might betray an exit or a threat. The far end of the passage disappeared into shadow, but the ground sloped downward, hinting at further secrets below. He weighed his options. The way back was closed, and the earth above was unstable. He could wait, hope for rescue, but nobody would come. Not out here. Not soon enough. With grim resolve, David pressed forward, moving carefully, flashlight beams slicing the darkness. He passed another oil drum, then a shattered crate, its contents spilled, a scatter of tools, a ruined map, more scraps of yellow tape. Each step took him deeper into the unknown, the tunnel curving away from his land and into the heart of the plateau. He thought of the bobcat, its wild eyes meeting his, and wondered if the animal had led him to this place for a reason. As the minutes stretched and the darkness thickened, he felt the weight of isolation settle over him, not just the physical kind, but the existential loneliness of a man confronting forces larger and more shadowed than he'd imagined. The ground trembled above, sending a rain of pebbles down the shaft. But David pressed on, his mind fixed on survival and discovery. He knew that whatever waited in these tunnels, corruption, danger, or truth, he would face it alone, and so, with the cold pressing in and the world above lost to him, David Cole took his first steps into the deep, leaving behind the last shreds of his old life and sealing his fate with every forward stride. Time had always moved strangely for David in moments of survival. Underground, it seemed to warp even further, measured in the rhythm of his own breathing and the unsteady echoes of his boots scraping against concrete and rusted steel. The narrow tunnel twisted deeper beneath the plateau, weaving through layers of ancient rock. Water dripped from unseen cracks above, pooling around his ankles as he advanced, searching for any sign of daylight, any clue to lead him out. The deeper he went, the more evidence he found that this was no mere utility tunnel. Faded warning placards, industrial canisters, broken implements. Each artifact whispered of hurried labor and secrecy. The pipes overhead were corroded, but not ancient, some painted with codes and colors that meant little to him, but hinted at hazardous materials. The air, thick with the metallic tang of spilled chemicals, burned in his nose and tightened his chest. Still, he pushed on. Eventually, the tunnel rose, climbing in fits and starts toward a weak orange light filtering through a rusty grate overhead. With every ounce of strength, David shoved at the grate, finally wrenching it free, and hauled himself up into daylight. He emerged behind the post office in the small mountain town of Cedar Ridge, mud-streaked and blinking in the sharp spring air. The world above ground felt jarringly normal, so ordinary it was almost unreal. Cars lined the streets, vendors set up along the square, bunting and balloons strung between lampposts for the spring festival. Children darted through crowds, faces painted, their laughter rising over the music of a brass band. Neighbors greeted each other, arms laden with pastries and produce. It was the kind of simple joy that had felt out of reach for David since his years in the service. Until now, it seemed like something that only happened in someone else's life. But survival demanded allies. He staggered into the festival crowd, drawing odd looks for his filthy clothes and scraped hands. The sight of Mark Rivera, a wiry man with grease stains on his jeans and an engineer's calm, was a lifeline. Mark was both a friend and a pragmatist, known for fixing what nobody else dared touch. David explained in hushed, urgent tones about the collapse, the tunnel, and the evidence he'd found. Mark's eyes narrowed, recognizing the gravity beneath David's words. Together, they found Dr. Claire Thompson among the festival stalls, her arms full of wildflowers and a notebook jutting from her bag. Claire was Cedar Ridge's environmental scientist, tireless in her work to protect the land from the appetites of companies like Apex. When she heard David's story, she became instantly focused, her mind shifting from pleasantries to problem-solving. The three of them slipped away from the noise, gathering in the back room of the diner to share information and plot their next moves. Their plan was simple, at least in theory. Mark would help David document the tunnels, taking photos and mapping the underground passageways. Claire would analyze the chemical residue and water samples. With their combined skills, they hoped to expose whatever Apex was hiding. There was comfort in the familiar mechanics of teamwork, a reminder that even against overwhelming odds, good people could still do the right thing. As the festival wore on, dusk fell, painting the mountains in shades of lavender and indigo. Lanterns flickered to life, and music drifted from the square. David felt a momentary sense of peace, almost believing that the worst was behind them. In that pocket of warmth and community, it was tempting to pretend that danger had passed. But danger, as always, arrived unannounced. A sudden, thunderous roar split the night, rattling windows and silencing laughter. The ground trembled with the shock of a massive explosion, far enough to spare the town, but close enough for everyone to see the towering column of smoke rising from David's field. The festival dissolved into confusion, people running toward the blast or pulling their children close. David, Mark, and Claire pushed through the chaos, urgency mounting with each step. When they reached the field, the devastation was absolute. The sinkhole was gone, replaced by a crater scorched black and choked with smoldering debris. Acrid smoke clawed at their throats, stinging their eyes. Whatever evidence had remained, the barrels, the pipes, the traces of contamination, was obliterated by fire and force. It was clear to David that this was no accident. Someone had destroyed the site on purpose, desperate to erase any trace of what lay beneath. Among the wreckage, a single wild sound broke through the chaos, a guttural, echoing roar. The bobcat, half mad with fear, shot from the smoking grass and vanished into the foothills, a streak of muscle and blood against the blackened ground. The animal's cry lingered in David's mind, a living reminder that what had happened here affected more than just people. All illusions of safety melted away, replaced by the knowledge that they were up against enemies willing to destroy land and life to protect their secrets. David stared into the darkness beyond the ruined field, the firelight flickering in his determined eyes. The old life was gone. There could be no turning back. In that moment, he understood. If the truth was to come out, it would have to be fought for. By him, by his friends, and by the wild things whose home was now a battlefield. The aftermath of the explosion settled over Cedar Ridge like a heavy, toxic fog. The festive mood was gone, replaced by anxiety and suspicion. David, Mark, and Claire gathered at the edge of the blast site just before midnight, drawn by the irresistible need to see for themselves what had been destroyed, and what, if anything, remained. The sky was pitch black above them, broken only by a wide band of cold stars and the silvery disk of the moon, throwing stark shadows across the scarred landscape. Black smoke curled from the heart of the ruined field, rising in fitful gusts as the wind changed direction. The once familiar stretch of grassland now looked like the aftermath of a war zone. What had been a gentle dip in the earth was now a deep, irregular pit filled with smoldering ash and jagged chunks of twisted metal. The acrid stench of burnt plastic and fuel stung David's eyes, mingling with the metallic taste that always came after an adrenaline surge. They moved as one across the field, boots crunching over brittle weeds and broken debris. Each step revealed more damage. A series of crushed barrels, blackened and leaking oily sludge. Wheel ruts gouged deep into the mud, evidence of heavy machinery brought in under cover of darkness. In the moonlight, the tire tracks shone with an unnatural slickness, arcing up the slope toward the far ridge. Whoever had orchestrated this destruction had come prepared and had left in a hurry. Mark bent low to examine one of the barrels, using a stick to prod its contents. Claire snapped photos on her phone, cataloging each piece of evidence, her breath coming fast and short as she worked. The wind shifted again, carrying the low whistle of distant coyotes and the underlying pulsing silence of a land that had been wounded. For David, the world felt suddenly unfamiliar, a place of hidden threats and shifting allegiances where nothing could be taken for granted. He looked around, searching for the bobcat, half hoping the animal might reappear, a living sign that not all was lost. But the only tracks he found were human, heavy, booted, fresh. The marks led up the ridge to the west, disappearing over the crest and into the night. For a moment, David hesitated, fighting the urge to follow. There was no telling who or what might be waiting on the other side. A low rumble broke the silence. Across the ridge, a pair of headlights flared to life, cutting a harsh, artificial line through the darkness. The beams swept back and forth, searching, then locked on the three figures standing in the ruins below. Instinct took over. David signaled to Mark and Claire, and together they slipped back toward the shelter of a nearby thicket, hearts pounding with the realization that they were not alone. The headlights held steady, then began to creep forward, engine growling softly in the stillness. The vehicle stopped at the edge of the crater, silhouetted against the burning remains of the field. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the doors opened, and two figures stepped out, faces hidden in shadow, movements confident and unhurried. One of them swept the ground with a powerful flashlight, the beam glinting off broken glass and metal. David pressed himself low against the cold earth, willing himself invisible. Mark and Claire did the same, breath hitching as the light passed within inches of their hiding place. The strangers stood at the crater's rim, surveying the damage, then spoke to each other in low, urgent voices David couldn't quite catch. The words themselves were unimportant. Their intent was clear. These were not investigators or rescue workers. They were guardians, sent to make sure nothing and no one interfered. Minutes stretched out, tense and silent. Then, as abruptly as they had arrived, the men returned to their truck, slammed the doors, and sped off into the darkness, tires spitting gravel in their wake. The threat lingered, even after the sound of the engine faded. David rose slowly, blood thundering in his ears, and exchanged a grim look with his companions. The message was unmistakable. They were being watched. This was no longer a battle for evidence or justice. It was a struggle for their own safety. As the moon reached its zenith, the three of them retreated from the ruined field, each lost in private calculation. Their world had shrunk to a simple equation: trust no one, expect nothing, and prepare for whatever came next. The night pressed close around them, thick with unanswered questions. Who were the men on the ridge? What secrets had been buried beneath David's land? And how far would their enemies go to keep those secrets hidden? David glanced back one last time. The image of the blasted field and prowling headlights burned into his memory. The ground itself seemed to mourn, scarred and smoking, as if warning them to tread carefully. But retreat was not surrender. The stakes had changed, and so had they. From now on, every move would be watched, every misstep punished. But David knew one thing for certain: he would not back down. As they slipped away through the grass, the wind carried a single ragged cry, a bobcat somewhere out there in the hills, calling out into the wounded night. It was a sound David would remember, long after the last embers faded and the shadows swallowed the land once more. Dawn brought little comfort to David, Mark, and Claire. They returned to town with exhaustion weighing on every step, the horrors of the night still clinging to their thoughts. The festival was over. Cedar Ridge had settled back into an uneasy quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Shadows still stretched long across the empty streets, and a heavy tension pressed down on the mountain air. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, a squat brick building at the heart of town, with the American flag fluttering above the door and a faded mural of the Rockies on one wall. The interior was as familiar as it was bleak. Old linoleum floors, the smell of burnt coffee, a bulletin board crowded with missing dog flyers and lost glove notices. Normally, the sheriff's department was the heartbeat of the community, a place for neighborly complaints and the sorting of minor disputes. But today, something felt wrong. David approached the front desk, Mark and Claire close behind, each clutching their own evidence. A battered phone, a Ziploc bag of contaminated soil, a notebook filled with field notes. Deputy Dean, a man with sandy hair and a politician's smile, greeted them without warmth. His eyes flickered with recognition, then hardened. David explained the explosion, the ruined field, the barrels and tracks. He spoke of danger, of being watched from the ridge, and of a feeling that the violence was far from over. But instead of concern, the deputy's face became blank, even bored. He shuffled through some paperwork, nodding with forced patience. When David asked about filing a report, Dean's answer was smooth but evasive. "We'll look into it. Accidents happen this time of year. Best to let the county handle these things." A sick feeling gnawed at David's gut. He pressed for an official record, demanded that the deputy take their statement. Reluctantly, Dean brought out a form and wrote a few perfunctory notes before sliding it away and changing the subject. Mark's frustration simmered just below the surface. while Claire's hands shook as she recounted the samples she'd collected and the photos she'd taken. Still, the deputy's indifference remained unbroken. When they finally left the station, the trio was more unsettled than before. Something had shifted. An invisible barrier now stood between them and the people sworn to protect the community. They gathered on the sidewalk, the morning wind cutting sharp and cold as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't take long for the truth to reveal itself. That afternoon, as they regrouped at Mark's garage, Claire noticed her phone was acting strange. Files had gone missing, pictures and notes erased or corrupted. David called the sheriff's office, only to find that their incident report had vanished from the records. Officially, there was no explosion, no contamination, no evidence of anything at all. Rage and dread churned together inside him. He knew what this meant. Someone inside the department was working to bury the truth. But who and why? The answer came sooner than he expected. Mark, using his engineering know-how and a little luck, traced a series of suspicious calls from the sheriff's office to a private number linked to Apex Terra Resources, the very corporation whose barrels had littered David's land. It was a gut punch, but not a surprise. The pieces began to fit together with a terrible clarity. Apex had reached into the heart of Cedar Ridge, buying silence with backdoor deals and private favors. The deputy, always eager for a promotion and a new truck, was now the watchdog for the company, tasked with making sure nothing ever reached the outside world. David felt his stomach turn as he realized that the enemy wasn't just a nameless corporation hidden behind glass towers in the city. It was right here in his own community, wearing a badge and shaking hands at church picnics. Despair threatened to take hold, but Claire's determination lit a spark in all of them. If the authorities were compromised, they would have to expose the truth on their own. There could be no more illusions of safety, no more reliance on the systems meant to protect them. The only path forward was to gather evidence, real, undeniable proof, and bring it into the light. Mark began designing a plan to re-enter the tunnels, this time armed with cameras and sensors to capture everything. Claire assembled a kit for soil and water samples, promising to analyze every drop for toxins. David felt the old Marine resolve stiffen his spine. The rules had changed. The fight was now personal, the cost potentially devastating. But he couldn't walk away. Not after what he'd seen, not while the land and its wild creatures, the bobcat most of all, were still at risk. The isolation that once defined his life became a kind of armor, steeling him against betrayal and fear. He would trust only those who had proven themselves, and he would let the wild guide his instincts as much as his training. Night came on fast, wrapping the town in secrecy once again. From his cabin porch, David looked out at the battered landscape, where frost glittered along the blackened edges of the field. Somewhere beyond the hills, the bobcat's cry echoed, a low, warning sound that cut through the silence. David knew then that this battle would not be fought alone. The wild was watching, waiting, ready to reveal the crimes that men tried so desperately to bury. He stood up, feeling the cold seep through his bones, and prepared for what would come next. The only certainty now was uncertainty, and the knowledge that justice, like spring, could never truly be stopped. The plan took shape in the small hours, under the hard glare of Mark's workshop lights. With the local authorities compromised, David, Mark, and Claire had no choice but to gather evidence themselves. The threat of Apex was no longer a distant fear. It was real, looming over every decision, every movement. The air in the garage was thick with resolve and the scent of machine oil. Maps sprawled across the workbench, each marked with tunnels, water tables, and notations about chemical waste. Mark's laptop blinked with live feeds from a pair of old GoPros, rigged to stream to a remote server Claire had set up, just in case things went wrong. Rain began to fall just before dawn, the kind that hammered on the roof and soaked the earth in minutes. By the time the trio reached David's battered pickup and drove back toward the field, the storm had deepened, turning the ground to slick, clinging mud. The crater's rim was already pocked with puddles, and the first runoff trickled into the sinkhole, carrying ash and chemical residue with it. They moved quickly, donning rain jackets and heavy boots, strapping packs to their shoulders. Claire handed out filter masks, her voice steady as she reviewed the checklist. Soil tubes, water test kits, batteries, flashlights, memory cards, flares. David scanned the horizon, nerves taut as wire. The world felt different, heavier. Even the birds seemed to sense the danger, staying hidden in the thickets as the group sloshed through the remains of the field and descended into the dark. Inside, the tunnels were worse than before. The recent explosion had destabilized the passageways. Jagged slabs of concrete leaned at awkward angles, and the pipes overhead groaned and spat rusty water. The stench of chemicals was overpowering, burning their eyes even through the masks. Every step sent echoes ricocheting through the gloom, the darkness closing in behind them like a living thing. Mark took the lead, flashlight slicing the shadows. He moved with the careful confidence of a man who trusted his own handiwork, but even he hesitated at some of the crumbling supports. Claire worked methodically, kneeling to scoop samples from puddles that shimmered with oily rainbows. David covered the rear, senses sharp, the old military training guiding his every move. He swept the walls for signs of tampering, fresh tool marks, footprints, evidence that someone else had passed this way. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. In some places, it poured in rivulets, pooling around their ankles and swirling with silt. The further they went, the more the water rose, turning the tunnel floor into a sluggish stream. Mark gritted his teeth and adjusted a headlamp, pushing forward even as the ground threatened to suck the boots off their feet. Deeper in the maze, the air thickened, laced with an acrid metallic fog. Claire's portable sensor beeped, alerting them to the presence of toxic gas. David signaled for the others to stay close, breathing through the filter and watching the flicker of his flashlight. Each step became a test of endurance, the group slogging onward through a tunnel that grew narrower and more unstable with every yard. Without warning, a thunderous crack split the air. Part of the ceiling sloughed away, sending debris crashing into the water. For a moment, panic threatened to scatter them. Mark shoved Claire to safety, mud splattering their legs, while David pulled them both back behind a bend in the tunnel as a wall collapsed, blocking the passage behind them. The way out was gone, swallowed by water and rubble. For a few heartbeats, all was chaos. Then, as the dust settled, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A low, sinuous shape, eyes glowing in the beam of David's light. The bobcat, wet and ragged but alive, appeared just ahead, paws barely making a sound as it threaded through the debris. It looked back at them, tail flicking, then darted down a side channel almost invisible in the gloom. Instinct told David to trust the animal. He urged the others on, following the bobcat through a twisting passage as water sloshed up to their knees and the walls seemed to close in. The cat led them through tight gaps and sudden drops, the path a hidden artery the engineers at Apex had likely never found. The tunnel narrowed further, but the air was clearer here, the ground less treacherous. At the far end, the group found themselves in a chamber where fractured concrete gave way to raw stone, a place where the land, not industry, dictated the way. They paused only long enough for Claire to collect a final sample and Mark to scan the space with his camera. The bobcat vanished into a crack in the rock, leaving them alone once more. But the sense of guidance lingered. Before they could regroup, the thunder of boots echoed behind them. Mercenaries, faces masked, rifles ready, their shouts distorted by the tunnels and the swirling gas. Apex had sent in its enforcers, determined to bury the secret for good. There was no time for hesitation. David barked a quick warning, and they ran, slipping and stumbling through the waterlogged darkness as bullets ricocheted off the stone. The passage twisted in on itself, a labyrinth of danger and blind corners. Mud and water hampered every step, and the toxic air left them gasping. The GoPros bobbed wildly, capturing shaky glimpses of chaos. The flash of weapons, the snarl of the bobcat far ahead, the desperate flight of 3 people refusing to be erased. As the group neared a fork in the tunnel, a massive detonation ripped through the earth, the shockwave shaking the ground and sending fresh debris crashing down. The exit ahead was blocked, stone and steel collapsing in a thunderous roar. They were trapped, the walls pressing closer, water rising, and enemy footsteps growing louder behind them. For a moment, time froze, and the only sound was the rushing water and David's heartbeat pounding in his ears. Was this the end? He wondered. The price of chasing truth in a world built on secrets? The tunnel shuddered again, dust and pebbles raining down, and all hope seemed poised to vanish with the next collapse. The shock of the explosion still rang in David's bones. Dust billowed through the collapsed passage, thick and choking, making it hard to see or breathe. Every sense was on high alert, ears tuned for the distant shouts and heavy boots of the mercenaries, eyes darting to the shifting shadows, skin prickling with the cold sweat of survival. The tunnel, once just a scar beneath the earth, had become a living trap. Walls sweating water, air heavy with the stink of chemicals and burnt wiring. The distant echo of their own footsteps warped and magnified. For a few heartbeats, the world seemed to narrow to a single thought: escape. David steadied himself, forcing his breathing into a steady rhythm, recalling lessons from the battlefield. Panic is death. Discipline is hope. Mark and Claire crouched beside him, wide-eyed, their clothes soaked and faces streaked with mud and fear. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit swelled, a metallic clatter, curses muffled by gas masks, the ruthless precision of professionals closing in on prey. David's mind raced, mapping the terrain, cataloging hazards and opportunities. The side channel where the bobcat had disappeared gnawed at his attention. Not just a lucky break, he realized, but a sign. The wild had always survived by reading the land, by trusting signs, by sensing what others missed. He whispered a wordless command to Mark and Claire, gestured toward the direction the animal had gone, and they pressed deeper into the tunnels, leaving the ruined passage behind. The mercenaries' voices faded for a moment, masked by the roar of rushing water. The group reached a chamber where a massive rusted valve protruded from a tangle of old pipes and broken stone. It looked like something left behind by another era, forgotten, but still functional. David's instincts sharpened. He remembered an old lesson. Strength wasn't just about firepower. Sometimes survival depended on reading the ground, on using the enemy's environment against them. The air in the chamber was cooler, fresher, and the water here rushed more violently, pouring through a fissure in the wall. David spotted a control panel, wires chewed by age and corrosion, and a heavy wheel attached to the main valve. He studied the markings, fingers trailing over faded warnings. Mark, ever the engineer, caught his meaning and moved to help, bracing himself against the slick concrete. Together, they threw their weight into turning the valve. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, with a metallic screech, the wheel began to move, and the ground vibrated as something deep in the earth shifted. Water thundered through the pipes, building pressure. Far behind, the mercenaries, sensing something was wrong, shouted an alarm, their lights sweeping madly across the walls as the chamber began to tremble. A sudden flood burst through a collapsed passage, sweeping debris and a wave of cold, fetid water toward their pursuers. The mercenaries staggered, shouting in confusion, their formation breaking as the underground current swept in. The sounds of boots and gunmetal gave way to shouts of panic, and then the roar of water as it crashed into the tunnel, forcing them back. David, Mark, and Claire clung to the wall, braced against the surge. In the chaos, the bobcat's snarl echoed through the chamber, sharp, wild, and everywhere at once. The darkness played tricks, magnifying the sound, making it seem as if predators hunted from every corner. The mercenaries, unnerved by the echoes and the water, fired blindly into the shadows, convinced they were surrounded by something more than just three desperate people. In that maelstrom of noise and confusion, David led his team through a narrow fissure that opened along the edge of the chamber, a space barely wide enough for a person, slick with water and mud, but free of enemies. He felt the presence of the wild cat ahead, its paw prints barely visible in the weak beam of his flashlight, and pressed forward, dragging Mark and Claire with him into the black. The trio stumbled onward, crawling over jagged stone and splintered pipes, following the faint, musky scent of the bobcat and the promise of freedom. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, replaced by the steady trickle of water and the drum of their own hearts. The tunnel grew brighter, the air fresher, until at last a thin seam of daylight appeared above. A grate twisted open, letting in the pale dawn and the scent of pine and cold, wet grass. They emerged gasping into the gray morning, mud-splattered and battered, but alive. For a moment, the world stood silent, the only sound the wind whispering through the grass. The bobcat was gone, vanished into the wilderness, but its tracks lingered, a silent reminder of the wild intelligence that had saved them. David looked at Mark and Claire, saw the exhaustion and the relief and the quiet triumph in their faces. In their hands, they clutched cameras caked with grime, bags of soil and water samples, and a story that could no longer be denied. Behind them, deep in the earth, Apex's mercenaries nursed their wounds and counted their failures. They had escaped the labyrinth, but the battle for truth was just beginning. Dawn on the Colorado Plateau was never truly gentle, but that morning it felt particularly raw. Mist clung low over the battered fields, softening the edges of devastation, but not the reality beneath. David, Mark, and Claire emerged from the tunnels to the world above, faces streaked with mud and exhaustion, clothing torn and heavy with the weight of water and survival. Behind them, the bobcat's tracks already faded in the dew, leaving only memories of the creature that had guided them through the darkness and into the pale light of morning. Their victory was not without cost. Mark stumbled and nearly fell, catching himself on a bent fence post, his breath coming in ragged bursts. David moved quickly to his side, seeing the unnatural twist in Mark's ankle, the deep bruise blossoming beneath torn denim on his leg. In the chaos of their escape, Mark had shoved David out of the path of collapsing stone, a quick, selfless motion that had left him pinned for agonizing seconds before Claire and David dragged him free. He tried to smile, brushing off concern, but pain was written all over his face, and it deepened with every step toward town. Claire fared little better. Her backpack, once loaded with scientific instruments, now held only what little could be salvaged: 2 sample vials, a battered hard drive, a handful of waterlogged notebooks. The rest, precious equipment, delicate sensors, months of research, had been crushed or swept away by the flood. Her loss was more than material. It was the years of labor, the hope of providing undeniable proof, gone in an instant. Still, she pressed on, her shoulders squared, refusing to let defeat show as she inventoried what remained. David, meanwhile, felt the weight of both relief and guilt. In the darkness, he'd made choices: when to run, when to fight, when to trust the wild over his own instincts. That Mark was injured and Claire's life's work nearly destroyed haunted him, gnawing at the edges of triumph. The world above was no safer than the tunnels below. The land itself bore the scars of violence and secrecy, blackened earth stretching out like a warning. There would be no going back to the life of silent seclusion he'd built. Not now. The return to Cedar Ridge was quiet and tense. Mark limped heavily, supported on one side by David, his words coming in short, strained bursts. Claire walked a step behind, clutching the salvaged video footage and soil samples as if they were the last hope for justice. When they reached the main street, people stared from behind curtains and half-open doors, whispers rising like dust as the battered trio hobbled past. The wild celebration of the festival was a distant memory, replaced by suspicion and fear. At the small clinic, Mark was rushed inside, doctors and nurses working quickly to set the broken bone and tend to cuts and bruises. The injury was severe, the pain lingering, but Mark gripped David's arm and squeezed hard. A silent thank you, a brotherly gesture that said more than words ever could. Claire stood watch in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, eyes shadowed by exhaustion and grief for what she'd lost. David lingered at the window, watching clouds gather over the hills, mind turning over every step that had led them here. He knew, even before Claire said it aloud, that his isolation was over. The secrets he had uncovered, the lines he'd crossed, could never be forgotten or ignored. He was no longer just a caretaker of a lonely patch of land. He was a witness, a fighter, someone bound to the wild and to the people beside him, whether he'd chosen it or not. Outside, the smoke from the blast site still hung in the air, drifting slowly across the ruined field. The Bobcat was gone, vanished into the wild, leaving only its memory, a flash of gold in the grass, a silent promise that the land would fight back. For David, the animal's disappearance felt like the ending of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. It was both loss and blessing, a reminder that not everything could be saved or held on to, no matter how fiercely one tried. The town, too, was changed. People who had once looked at David with quiet indifference now watched with something close to fear, or awe, or hope. Whispers spread about the explosion, the corporate trucks at night, the battered veteran who'd taken on powers greater than himself. Some offered quiet support, a thermos of soup on the porch, a note left at the door. Others turned away, frightened by what the truth might cost. As the sun rose higher, Claire sat up in the corner of Mark's garage, piecing together what remained of their evidence. She wiped the hard drive, salvaged the video, and tested what soil samples she had. The proof was there, if fragile. Chemicals in the water, traces of illegal dumping, footage of armed mercenaries in corporate uniforms. The truth, battered but unbroken, clung to life. Mark, his leg in a splint, refused to rest. He cataloged their findings, drawing maps and timelines, determined to leave nothing to chance. David hovered near the door, eyes always on the horizon, heart beating in sync with the wind that swept over the wounded field. He knew that the story wasn't finished, that the cost of survival was more than bruises and broken bones. When dusk came, David stood alone at the edge of the crater, listening for the wild. Somewhere, a bobcat's cry echoed, a sound neither mournful nor triumphant, but ancient, promising that the land would remember everything. He bowed his head, grateful for the unlikely bond that had led him through darkness and danger, knowing that both loss and hope would live with him forever. Spring arrived at Cedar Ridge with a vengeance, transforming the battered plateau in a matter of weeks. What had been a landscape of scars and cinders became a patchwork of new color. First green shoots among the blackened earth, then bursts of wildflowers painting the fields with hope. The charred remains of the blast site softened beneath rain and sunlight, and slowly, life returned to places where, for a moment, only silence and fear had ruled. For David, everything felt different. His cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, now echoed with the remnants of crisis. Muddy boots by the door, the acrid memory of smoke still clinging to the wood, the faint ghost of pain in his shoulders each morning. But there was purpose in every new day, a sense that he was no longer just an observer of the land's struggles, but a part of its fight for survival. The evidence they'd risked everything to recover became the center of their world. Claire, methodical as ever, spent her days in the cramped, sunlit corner of Mark's garage, hunched over microscopes and battered laptops. Piece by painstaking piece, she assembled a case so airtight it could not be dismissed. Chemical signatures in the water samples, rare earths and petroleum compounds far above safe levels, time-stamped footage of illegal dumping, and the armored mercenaries dispatched to cover it up. Mark, his leg still healing, compiled timelines and maps, cross-referencing every truck sighting and radio call they'd intercepted. Their efforts were slow, careful, deliberate, each day bringing a small but vital victory against the machinery of denial and corporate power. When the files were finally delivered to state and federal investigators, the response was swift and fierce. Apex's name filled the headlines, painted across social media and local radio, no longer just a faceless entity, but a target of anger and demands for justice. The federal prosecutor arrived in a black SUV flanked by stern men and women in dark suits, carrying more authority in their posture than all the town's deputies combined. The news cameras came next, their bright lights and relentless questions a shock to Cedar Ridge's quiet streets. With each new revelation, the community's mood shifted. Where there had been fear and suspicion, there was now outrage, then something softer, a tentative pride, the sense that, perhaps for the first time, their voices mattered. The people who had once watched David with wary eyes now nodded in greeting or stopped to offer a hand. Farmers brought coffee and bread to the garage. Teachers and teenagers volunteered to help organize the files. Even those who remained skeptical could not ignore the transformation. The land was healing, the air was lighter, and the old wounds, both natural and human, were beginning to close. David felt the change inside himself as well. He became a man others sought for advice and reassurance, his quiet resolve a steady anchor in uncertain times. The wild places he once walked alone were now trails shared with neighbors, parents teaching children to respect the land, volunteers clearing debris, students learning to spot the signs of returning life. Quail calls echoed in the mornings, their voices rising above the laughter of kids running through the tall grass. It was a new kind of peace, not the lonely silence of before, but the living, breathing hum of a community finding its strength. The wild bobcat, so much a part of his journey, remained an elusive guardian. Sometimes, in the early dusk, David would spot a flicker of movement among the sagebrush, a flash of gold, a silent shadow watching from the hills. It felt at times like a blessing or a promise. Nature, wounded and wary, was learning to trust again. David understood now that this trust was not a given, but a fragile bond, built in moments of crisis and tested by every choice they made. The lessons settled over him, clear as the spring air. No crime, no matter how carefully buried, could stay hidden forever. The land remembered, the wild watched, and sometimes the most unlikely voices, whether a battered veteran, a tenacious scientist, or the cry of an injured animal, could break through the silence and demand justice. Life moved forward. Mark healed, his limp fading as strength returned. Claire's research was recognized in national reports, her work credited with exposing a scandal that reached far beyond their small town. Cedar Ridge itself became a symbol of resilience, of the possibility of redemption, of the way a community could come together, even after betrayal, to reclaim what mattered most. And as wildflowers bloomed in the places where chemicals had once poisoned the ground, David knew he could not return to his old life. He had become part of something greater, a protector not only of his own peace, but of the fragile, enduring balance between people and the wild. The echo of the bobcat's cry remained with him, a call to vigilance, a reminder that the land always finds a way to reveal what man tries to bury. On warm evenings, as the sun dipped low over the plateau and the air thrummed with insects and bird song, David would sit on his porch and watch the fields. Sometimes, if he was lucky, he'd catch sight of that wild shape slipping through the grass, fierce and free. In those moments, he felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the land, but to every living thing that called it home. He understood, finally, that true healing was a shared journey, one that demanded courage, patience, and the willingness to trust in the wild, even when the world tried to silence it. And for the first time in years, he was ready to walk that path, no longer alone, but as part of a community, part of the land, forever changed by what they had fought to protect. The weeks after the scandal broke marked a season of reckoning for Cedar Ridge. Federal agents and investigators moved through town, their dark SUVs parked alongside battered pickups and school buses, drawing stares from children and old men alike. Reporters came and went, chasing headlines, while Apex's name became a byword for greed and recklessness far beyond the county line. The dust of controversy didn't settle quickly, but something deeper took root. A cautious trust, slowly binding the community together. David watched it all unfold from his porch, the world coming and going beneath the endless Colorado sky. Yet even with the attention, the phone calls, and the parade of questions, life refused to be defined by scandal alone. As spring deepened, the fields and forests continued their patient renewal. Wildflowers crowded the old blast site, color exploding where only black ash had lingered. Quail and songbirds returned, their calls twining through the dawn. The river, once tainted, now ran clean, reflecting the soft blue of the unclouded sky. The townsfolk, too, found their footing. Old feuds faded as neighbors worked together, repairing fences and clearing debris, planting new trees and laying seed where the land had been stripped bare. Mark, healed and sturdy, organized weekend work crews, showing teenagers how to patch irrigation lines and clear out ditches choked by runoff. Claire's work inspired a new environmental committee, drawing students, parents, and retirees eager to protect the land they'd nearly lost. Even the town council, long a battleground for petty arguments, came together with a shared sense of purpose, passing ordinances to monitor industry and safeguard the fragile plateau. David found himself drawn into the heart of this new community, not as an outsider, but as a symbol of resilience. The cabin was no longer just a refuge. It became a gathering place, a base for volunteers, and a shelter for those who needed a quiet moment to recover. He learned, over countless cups of coffee on the porch and evening meals by lamplight, how deeply the people around him cared for the land and each other. There was something sacred in their shared resolve, a stubborn insistence that, whatever storms might come, they would stand together. The wild bobcat remained a phantom presence, never truly tamed, never truly gone. Sometimes at dusk, David glimpsed it slipping along the edge of the field, lean and scarred, a living memory of everything they had endured. He understood, in a way he never had before, that trust was a gift, not a right. The animal had led him into the darkness not out of affection, but out of some primal wisdom, an understanding that survival for both people and wild things depended on a willingness to risk, to adapt, to trust when all instinct screamed caution. That lesson rippled through the community. Parents taught children to watch for animal tracks, to move gently through the tall grass, to treat each living thing as a neighbor rather than a threat. Hunters and hikers left offerings by the old sinkhole, a stone, a feather, a handful of seeds, in quiet thanks for the land's mercy. Stories began to circulate, tales of deer returning to the high meadows, of a coyote pup rescued from a barbed wire fence, of the bobcat itself seen watching from a rocky outcrop before melting away into dusk. Each story became a thread in the fabric of a new, shared identity, one that honored the wild, even as it embraced the future. David came to cherish these moments of resonance. In the hush before sunrise, he'd walk the fields, boots sinking into dew-wet earth, breath mingling with the scent of sage and pine. Sometimes he'd pause where the sinkhole had been, running his hand through the grass, remembering the terror and courage that had brought him there. Other times, he'd find himself listening for the telltale rustle of the bobcat, the quiet sign that the wild still watched, still waited. He knew in his bones that life could change in an instant, a careless footstep, a split-second decision, a wild animal choosing to trust. But he also knew that these moments carried meaning far beyond the heat of crisis. They shaped who he was and who the community might become. As word of Cedar Ridge's fight spread, people from neighboring counties reached out, asking for advice, for help, for hope. Students wrote essays about the bobcat and the explosion. Families visited the restored field, reading signs that explained the land's recovery and the dangers of short-sighted industry. Even those who had once doubted the worth of fighting for nature found themselves changed, seeing perhaps for the first time the cost of turning away. David became a quiet advocate. He spoke at town halls, at high school assemblies, at impromptu gatherings in church basements, and under the shade of cottonwoods. He told the story not just of loss and confrontation, but of the bond forged in crisis, between neighbors, between people and wild things, between past wounds and future hope. He always ended with a question. If a wild animal trusted you, would you trust it back? Would you let it lead the way? even into the unknown? He challenged others to listen for the signs nature sends, to step out of fear and into stewardship, to believe that healing, though never easy, was always possible. As summer approached, Cedar Ridge felt changed in ways both profound and subtle. The land healed, the water ran clear, and the people carried themselves with a new, quiet pride. But beneath it all, the wild remained, a reminder of what had been lost and won, and of the vigilance required to keep darkness at bay. On a late evening, with the first fireflies drifting over the fields, David sat on his porch and watched the horizon fade from gold to indigo. A movement caught his eye. The bobcat, poised on the rise, silhouetted against the last light. For a moment, the world seemed perfectly balanced, wild and tame, past and future, fear and trust. He smiled, content in the knowledge that the story would go on, told in the footprints left on muddy banks, in the laughter of children running through wildflowers, in every voice that dared to speak up when the land called out for help. The story of Cedar Ridge was not just his own, but belonged to all who had chosen to trust, to act, to listen. And as darkness settled, David felt not an ending, but an invitation. If a wild animal trusted you, would you trust it back and let it lead the way? Have you ever felt nature send you a sign you couldn't ignore? Share your story and let the land's voice be heard.